Welcome to this webinar regarding outcome-based doctoral education. It's being narrated by Bob Harris, a member of the Board of Doctoral Education at Karolinska Institute and head of the Quality Assurance Working Group within the Board of Education. The presentation has been made in collaboration with Ingela Thorsen, Cormac McGraw and Mikkel Forad. And what we'll do is we'll go through the presentation one slide at a time, you deciding the tempo by clicking through the slide as you will. On slide 2 you see the aims of this webinar, which are summarized in these 3 points. The first thing we'll do is go through the theory of intended learning outcomes, why they should be used and in what circumstances. We'll then go on to actually see how the learning outcomes can be coupled with specific intended learning activities, and lastly in this point how they can be evaluated in an effective manner. Secondly, we'll go through the more practical basis of how to formulate ILOs at 3 different levels, either general terms for a project or specifically for an individual who's been recruited to a PhD education. And lastly, there'll be some few slides to show how to use ILOs in practice. On slide 3 you see a classic yin-yang diagram showing research and education. We use the term research here instead of doctoral because it works better in this context. And the point of this slide is to get the basic definition of what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the presentation. And that really is that research and education are 2 halves of a whole, here depicted in the white and the black areas. Research should be done in an educated way, and education should not just be done purely for the purposes of being educated, but as a means of doing research. In this respect, then learning activities within research should be considered to be both research and education, and ensuring good quality of this both research and education might be facilitated by having this yin-yang concept in mind. On slide 4 we address the question of quality assurance in doctoral education. The picture is supposed to represent a timeline from admission of a PhD student through a half-time control and after 4 years, at least in the case of Sweden, to a thesis defense. Each marker on the bottom axis would then represent 1 year's worth of research education time. And the question is, how do we assure the graduating students are employable? So at the point where you see the red arrow on the upper right hand side, how can we be sure the students have attained the skills that will be necessary for them to take place in society as academic researchers, as clinicians, working in industry or doing something else? You'll see from the color of the purple triangle that there's an increase. This is meant to represent a progression, an increase in knowledge from admission to thesis defense. And the question then is, how do we monitor progress to make sure that there's an upward trend of this triangle? This really is the essence of why one would choose to use ILOs in doctoral education, as we will now see. In slide 5 you'll see some background to quality education issues in doctoral education. It's not the right of a Swedish university to take in PhD students, and if there's insufficient quality in the doctoral training, then the possibility for examining new PhD students could be withdrawn. Högskoleverket, or the Swedish governmental ordinance as it's stated in English, inspected all medical faculties at university level in 2008, and their recommendations are depicted on the lower half of this slide. What you see in red is that they specifically said that pedagogy and doctoral education should be improved and that ILOs should be specified for each student. On slide 6 you'll see Karolinska Institute's response to this recommendation from the government ordinance. This is an excerpt from the strategy document taken in 2012, and among the points listed you'll see at the bottom again in the red text that outcome-based education was specified as one area to be addressed. On slide 7 you'll see an excerpt from the examination ordinance depicting the description of intended learning outcomes for doctoral education. You might be wondering where ILOs have come from. Is it something that administrators have just thought up to make our lives more difficult? And the answer, of course, is no. They've always existed, and you'll find them written in any rule book for any Swedish university, and have been for many years, but they've been poorly implemented. And they've always been described in this way as well. You'll see that there are 3 different domains indicated in red ink: knowledge and understanding, proficiency and aptitude, ability to assess and approach. Take a few minutes to read through the text here. You'll see that on reading the text, then these are ILOs which are defined in very general terms, and that's the point of them. The ILOs as stated in this examination ordinance will be applicable to any PhD student within Sweden, and so these will be representations of ILOs at a very general level. So we now move on to slide 8. Up until now we've been dealing with the theory of ILOs, and now it's time to move into the practical side of things. What you see on this slide is the question that's been posed: what should be the content of ILOs for doctoral students? And I've addressed this in 2 questions. What do you consider a fully qualified PhD student at the time of thesis defense to be capable of demonstrating? And how does this relate to those general ILOs which are described in the Higher Education Ordinance? So take a few minutes to reflect on what your personal criteria would be for judging whether a PhD candidate is worth their thesis. If you're a supervisor, then write the list of qualities, skills that you expect your students to be capable of. And if you're a student, then think in the same terms of things that you'd like to be able to do at that time. On slide 9, you'll see some suggested answers to the question posed on the previous slide, and these are areas that the Board of Research Education at Karolinska would consider should be included in the answer. They represent many different activities, many different aims, but can be summarized maybe in these 4 points. So the first will be to demonstrate that you've actually produced some research, and this will be then entail that one has been able to design the research efficiently, one's been able to learn techniques in order to be able to produce data which should then be appropriately analyzed, for example. The second thing is that there should have been a demonstration of an ability to present research findings. There's no point doing something if you can't explain what you've done to someone else. And of course this should be done at 2 levels, both written and orally. The thesis defense itself will combine many of these different goals and will be a summary of skills and knowledge. A demonstration of knowledge of the area, a knowledge outside of the area, how to contextualize the research findings of the student, as well of course the presentation skills and an ability to think up arguments. Last but not least, it's quite important for PhD students to develop a research network, to learn to collaborate both internationally, nationally and inside the lab. And many of these activities will be needed to be demonstrated both at international and local levels. So the question is, then comes, how do we formulate intended learning outcomes and define specific intended learning activities that will enable achievement of these skills and knowledge? In slide 10 you'll see a definition of intended learning outcomes, which is as follows: what the learner could be expected to know, understand, be capable to perform or make judgment about by the end of a certain period of study. There are 3 aspects then to think about with respect to this definition. The first is that ILOs are an expectation. It's not necessary to fulfill all intended learning outcomes necessarily, although the more that one's achieved the better. The second is that they're multifaceted. Here we see understanding, capable of performing, and making judgments about. These are 3 different areas that are reflected in the 3 different domains that we've previously discussed. The third point is there should be a time aspect. There should be a finite time in which an ILO should have been achieved by completion of an appropriate learning activity with a correct evaluation. And ILOs without timelines are not so effective. In slide 11, you see a scheme that depicts self-directed learning. If we start in the top right-hand corner, the first phase is to be aware of what's needed. Continuing on the wheel to the right in phase 2, then one needs to evaluate or make a decision about how the learning process will occur. And that leads to the bottom, phase 3, to the actual learning, the activity. The following phase would be to apply the knowledge learned and to widen the concept with collaborative thinking, which would lead eventually to the 5th phase, which is an evaluation of how it's gone. And of course the wheel will keep turning. Based on the evaluation, one will be able to define the next task, and so on. In slide 12, we see an example, an everyday example, of intended learning outcome and activity and its evaluation. On the left you see the 3 domains: knowledge and understanding, skills and ability, making judgment and approach. And on the right then you see activities related to driving a car. So at the top, for knowledge and understanding, then one needs to understand what the rules say about driving a car. And one would need to also understand the basics of how a car works. In the middle, then the skills and ability will be reflected in an ability to actually drive a car, and maybe to fill up the petrol and do some basic car mechanics, changing the oil, for example, changing the tires. And lastly, and most importantly, the important thing is how to drive in traffic, to be aware of what's expected and to evaluate how one actually drives. In slide 13, we start to get to the nitty-gritty, which is actually how to write an intended learning outcome. You see from the slide that there are 2 components to an intended learning outcome: a verb indicating what will actually be done, and a noun which reflects the subject. So in this simple example, then you see in red that the verb would be to select an appropriate method to conduct and statistically analyze. This will reflect the activities of what's being done. And the noun then would be the results from the lab tests. So all in all, this would be a simple intended learning outcome for a project level. In slide 14, you see some advice about how to write efficient intended learning outcomes. Of course, one can't just let one's imagination run riot, but there have to be some type of control. So it's important to remember that the intended learning outcomes should be concrete, they should be transparent, there shouldn't be any hidden meanings. Secondly, they should be realistic. This is quite important in the world of science, that one makes sure one has one's feet on the ground. And then, of course, that intended learning outcome should be coupled both to an intended learning activity, and it's not worth anything unless it can be appropriately assessed. On slide 15, we asked the question when to assess progress, and there were 2 possibilities: a summative assessment, which is a snapshot done at a defined time, or a formative assessment that will occur several times over the length of, for example, here shown the thesis. So the x-axis then shows the scale, as we've seen before, from admission through half-time to thesis, and the arrows will show either the block arrows, the summative assessment, or the hatched arrows, then the formative assessment. And you can see that there are 2 summative assessments and then several opportunities for formative assessment during the course of a PhD. In slide 16, you see a depiction of how intended learning outcomes can bring together these 2 forms of assessment, as there'll be elements of the intended learning outcomes both in the summative and in the formative assessment processes. This is why intended learning outcomes are quite integral to all types of examination. In slide